Alright, so I'm going to jump in and work this first project along with you. You can see how I work and some things that I'm thinking about while I'm doing them. If you look in our layers palette, you can see I've got it all set up like we had in a previous video. My background is a nice middle gray. The basic shapes on their own layer, and they've got a layer mask masking out their background. And I'm going to do all of my painting on layer 1, at least most of the painting. We'll talk about how we can change things up in just a little bit. Additionally, I've got some other layers that show reference photos, and these are the reference photos I give you that'll help you see how shadows should fall and give you an idea of how you can work with your objects. Very important to pay attention to where highlights are, where the shadows are, and specifically how the shadows should be looking on and off your object. I've got them on their own layers so I can turn them off and on as necessary, and I can move them around so I can see everything else. For now, I'm going to keep it turned off. So I've got layer 1 selected. This first one we want to do is just your basic shading. I don't want to see any color, I don't want to see any textures, nothing like that. We're just going to work in black and white shades of gray. If you want, you can work in your swatches. These are the pre-made colors, usually in their own palette at the top right-hand corner. And I'm just going to be working in these basic shades of gray from here. On the circle, since my background is a 50% gray, I'm going to choose one of these little bit lighter shades of gray. I've got my paintbrush tool. The first thing I'm going to do is make sure my opacity is set to 100%. I'll hit 0 on my keyboard. And I've got a pretty good size brush. For now, I'm going to keep the hardness just really soft, and you'll see why in just a second. And I'm just going to paint in a solid mid-tone gray. The reason I'm starting with the mid-tone is now I know how I can move lighter and darker. I don't want to just start off with a white. I want to start off mid-tone and be able to be flexible back and forth. If I find that I'm starting off with white, my objects tend to be much lighter. However, if I start with a shade darker, they tend to be a lot more realistic. I can get really dark and really light. Let's look at our brushes again. Again, remember you can make your brush harder or softer. And if I did mine very hard and I started to shade things in, I'm going to grab a white. I like to start off with my highlights, and we'll pretend that the highlight is coming from the top left-hand corner. If I did this, I'm going to drop my opacity down to about 20%. That way I can click multiple times and build it up. This is what a hard edge brush will start to look like. And it's not too bad. A lot of people work with this. Maybe I'll drop my opacity and size down a little bit. And I can slowly build up the way the whites would look. The highest highlight point is right here. And then I'll work itself out. Again, you'll have to build it up just like you're building up with a watercolor type texture. Then I'll swap over to black, and then I'll build up some of the shadow side of this black. And working with a hard edge brush, it gives you a great little kind of texture to it. Maybe I'll turn on my pressure sensitivity so I get some smaller edges with light pressure. And I'm swapping back and forth with white and black for my foreground color. And that's what that looks like. I'm going to erase everything away. This time, I'm going to swap over to a very soft edge brush. This time, turn your hardness down to 0. A softer edge brush will give you a much more natural kind of feel. Again, we're going to start off with a mid-tone gray. Oops, put it back to 100%. Got a pretty good size brush. Mid-tone gray. Then I'm going to select the white. Again, white is the absolute lightest we can make it. And so I'm going to set my opacity down to about 10 to 20%. And you can see in one hit, now it's going to be much softer. Let's turn off that sizing. And I can gradually build it up. And when I gradually build it up, you can see how it blends together very beautifully. I love using a soft edge brush when I do my painting like this. If I want it to look realistic, you can see in just a couple of clicks, everything blends together nice and soft. Let's grab black this time and start adding in the darker areas. If you look closely, I'm not putting my whole brush right in the center of it. I'm actually hitting it on the edge and slowly building up from there. I can drop my opacity down to 10%. And then quickly build up those types as well. And so now I've got a great lighter and darker area that I can work with. If I need to, I can maybe select a mid-tone gray and push this back a little more. Maybe it was getting a little too dark. And that's looking good too. Always make sure you got a good highlight. That highlight is consistent. It's coming from the top left, and so all my shadows should go down to the bottom right from there. Now that I've got a nice form shadow working, hey, we can work on the background. Let's give it a cast shadow. Just for the sake of argument, remember you should always be placing your paintings on different layers. So rather than painting on the background, I'm going to make one more layer. We'll call this layer 2. It's in between my background and my basic shape. And remember, you can also use your selection tools. Since it's nice and round, I'm just going to choose the Elliptical Marquee tool. And I'm going to make an elliptical marquee, click and drag out off to the side right here. And so wherever I paint, it's going to stay inside of that particular area. Grab my brush tool again. I'm going to hit Command H to hide my selection. And when I start to paint, you can see, hey, there it is. Remember, the darkest area needs to be right up under the edge here, and it's going to get a little bit lighter as it pulls away. Still being pretty dark. I want to keep it that way. But there's that area working with it. Now, the ball shouldn't be just hovering in the middle of space. And actually, if it was sitting on the ground, I should have maybe some ground plane. So I'm going to select my background layer. Let's get wild. Got it white loaded up on my brush, and I'm just going to hit it just a bit. Nope. Make sure we deselect. Command D will deselect what I'm working on. Let's give it a little bit of a light area. You can see that makes your shadow really pop out from here. Maybe some in the background too. That's looking good. Remember, if your ground plane is light and it's bouncing off, I get some reflected light, so maybe I'll go back to layer 1 and let's hit it a little bit and kind of lighten up this area. So now I've got a lighter area down here at the bottom. If need be, I can check my pressure sensitivity and we'll add in some highlights to there. Now the ball is really starting to look a little bit metallic. I've got some reflected light going on. It's not perfectly gradient from one area to the other. That looks really, really good from there. We'll call that one done. If I wanted, I can go back, maybe darken in the drop shadow just a little bit more. Grab my black, and we'll paint that in from there. Your cast shadows don't have to be perfect, just as I did it there. If you want to free form your cast shadows, totally up to you. But you can see how using the selection tools makes everything go a lot faster because you're staying within that area. This will be really important. Let's try the cube for this one. So the cube, I've got black loaded up. Let's turn off the pressure sensitivity. If I did start to paint these, oops, let's deselect it. Let's go back to layer 1. Make sure you got the right layer selected. I want those edges on this cube to be nice and sharp as well. And if I start painting, well, you can see they'll blend over from one edge to the other. So let's back up. Option Command Z will back up in your history palette. That's what we want. This time I'm going to grab my Magic Wand tool. With Magic Wand, this allows me to sample all the layers. I've got continuous to turn on, and I can sample each side. We'll say that this is the lighter side, so I'm going to not make it white, maybe a good middle tone. Grab my brush, we'll set that back to 100%, and let's paint in there. Oop, make sure you got layer 1. Keeps wanting to reselect that. So there's the lighter side. Grab my wand tool, which happens to be W on my keyboard. Press B. This one's going to be a little bit darker. We'll make that closer to a mid-tone. W. And let's get this one to be the darker side. So it's going to be darker than the 50% background. And that's what that looks like. If I deselect it, hey, that's your basic cube, but let's make it look a lot more realistic. Remember, if you've got a light hitting it, even the lighter side is going to have a little bit of variation between it. So I'm going to select the light side with my Magic Wand, Command H to hide it. Let's grab my brush. If I hold down my Option key, check out what happens. Option will bring up my color picker. I get my little eyedropper tool. I can click right on that area. So I've loaded that up. Now I know that I need to pick an area that's lighter than that. So let's make, let's go for white. Drop my opacity, We'll press 2. Let's make this top area be just a little bit lighter than the bottom area. Maybe even giving that edge up there a little bit of a highlight. Let's do the same thing for the very top of the cube. I've got it selected, Command H to hide it. Grab my brush, and then we're going to work towards this edge. Let it be a little bit lighter. Don't worry if you still got the black outline going through there. I'm not too much worried about that. Maybe I'll even grab a darker gray, not necessarily black. Knock that down 10%. That's looking really, really good. From there, lighten that up. And we'll swap back over to my magic wand, hide it, select my brush, and let's get a little bit darker along this edge. So as it gets dark, it's going to go dark down to here. Once I get my cast shadow, this will really start to look like a cube. Now it's starting to look volumetric. It's not just a simple cube that you have. We'll deselect that. Hey, to get a great shadow edge from this one, I'm going to use my Polygon Lasso tool. Polygon Lasso will allow me to click different areas and just make a straight edge selection. I'm going to select layer 2. That's where my cast shadows are going to be. Click at this edge, maybe it'll go off. And this is where looking at some of your reference photos will come in handy as far as what should a cast cube shadow look like. I've got that area selected, but remember I'm working on layer 2, which is behind this. So now if I choose my brush tool, Command H will hide that. It'll cast that shadow out to there. I'm working in black, 10%, so it's taking me a lot of passes. Let's make my brush a little bigger. A lot of passes to darken that up. But that's what we want to see right there. Looking really, really good. Really good. It's going to be darker as it gets closer and gets lighter as it pulls out. Maybe I'll go back to layer 1 and reselect it. Now that I got several different colors, I need to be careful with my selection. Make that edge down there a little bit darker. Awesome. If I wanted to add some bounce to it, so some of these colors are bouncing off the other one, maybe we'll grab some lighter, make my brush a little bit smaller. Still working in 10%. We'll get some lightness bounced up from there. It just adds a little bit of extra texture to what we're working with. Wonderful, wonderful. Very good. So that's the basics of working between those two ones. Look at the same thing for your cylinder. Cylinder's got two sides. One side of it should probably be nice and solid. The curved edge needs to have a curved side to it. Same way for your cone. And this is where the examples will come into play. This one shows, yeah, there's our cylinder, there's our cones to work with. So if I was drawing a cylinder, sorry, I'm zooming in on you, Command Z. Notice that here's the flat side. Flat side is relatively one color. So whatever I draw here should be the same thing. And then the curvature of a cone, I've got one core shadow that goes towards the center. And specifically if it's laying down, then it should maybe have a little lighter edge wherever the light is on that side. And it should have maybe a darker edge with some bounced light, some reflected light on the other side. If I was working for the cone does the same thing. It tapers to one edge. It starts off, it's got a core shadow, either in the center or moving around to the darker side. It's got a highlighted side, and it's blending into there. And then on the other side, this is much lighter because it's bouncing, the light's bouncing off of these other objects as well. I won't make you watch me do that one. Instead, let me show you the second part of this one. So I want you to turn in three different files for me. So I would save this one. We're going to go to File and Save As. And I'm just going to call this one Basic Shapes Gray. Whatever you want to call it for that one. The format's going to be Photoshop. That way I can save all of my layers. All that looks good, and we'll hit Save. From here, I'm going to save it again. Just File and this time Save As. Now I'm going to save a copy of it, and then we're going to call this one Color. So I've got two of them saved. I've got a grayscale. This one's going to have color to it. Go back into layer 1, and we'll delete everything away. Same way for layer 2. And we'll even fill back in our grayscale. Oops, shift delete, give me 50% background. This time, I want you to select a color to work with. Again, you can use your swatches because the swatches have not just a solid mid-tone color of everything, they also get a little bit lighter and a little bit darker. So I'm going to start off with red. Again, we'll go to our circle, grab my brush, make it a little bit bigger. If you want, you can play around with harder edge brushes. I'm going to stick with the mid-tone brush. Give us a solid red color to work with. That looks good. All blended in from there. If I pull up my color picker at the bottom of the toolbox, this is what it looks like. This is how you should pick your colors, getting lighter and darker. Of course, if you go up and down, this is the intensity of the color. So the higher it gets, the higher the intensity, the quote, more red it gets. But to get lighter, you need to go back and forth, side to side, left to right. So to pick a lighter shade of red, I actually need to move it closer to the upper left-hand side. When I get darker, we're moving it to the bottom right-hand side. So it's in this arc that I want to pick the different tints and shades of my colors. Let's see, I'll move it up to here. Another thing you can think of if you know about analogous color schemes is I don't necessarily have to have a lighter shade of red. I can actually move down into some yellows to pull from, or oranges. Let's do that. Let's get wild. So I'm going to make this not just a lighter red, but a different hue of red. If the lightest color I choose is this, then that's as light as it's going to get. So we'll say OK to that. Let's back out. And from here, I'm going to set my opacity down to 10%. Let's drop my brush down a little bit smaller and actually start to add on here. Maybe that's a little bit more. There we go. It's going to take several build-ups because I'm working at a lower opacity. It's totally okay. Now I've got a nice highlight area towards the center. If I wanted, let's really get wild. Yeah, now it's getting into a nice warmer area. That's totally doable. So yellow is lighter, it's warmer. You can do that in your painting. Let's move it back down to the reds for the mid-tones. Let's pull some of those back in there. For the shadows, I can use dark red. Let's get down to right about there. I can pull that in. So that's looking really good. Or, instead of a dark red, let's do the opposite. Let's go purple. So now I've got a dark purple type color I'm picking with. Those tend to work out really, really good too. So don't think in terms of black and white. Think in terms of lighter and darker. And it really doesn't matter what color you're working with. In this case, I'm just working with analogous colors. Good color scheme. Hey, I'm actually losing some of my red. Let's pull that back in there. But think about how those colors play and interact with each other. When you're using color, anything goes. This works out really, really well. Let's see here. Come on. I want to make that nice darker. Let's do a dark, dark blue. It's almost black. So now my red ball is picking up lots of different colors there. Still looks natural, still works out really well. If I wanted to have some reflected light, let's say I've got my shadow, we'll work on my shadow layer. Again, I'm using my ellipse tool to make a selection. I'm going to hide it. This cast shadow, let's make that a nice blue. Look at that. Look at that. Look how awesome that is. Let's make it a little bit darker. Remember, darker, closer it in gets. Maybe even more darker. Let's pull it up into the purples. Right up under there. And maybe for my background, instead of it being solid gray, we'll pull in some greens. Let's do a light green. Oops, still got my selection. We'll deselect the circle. Now if it's got a green area that's sit on, some of that green is going to be picked up inside of my red. So that needs to be evident inside of here. Let's turn on, yeah, there we go. Let's turn on that. A little bit of green being picked up. It's going to muddy up the waters a bit. I don't like the way that looks. Let's get a little bit closer. There we go. Do be aware of what area you're working on. Maybe instead of green, let's pull it closer to yellow. Be aware of what layer all the time that you're working on, because the worst thing in the world is to be doing this great job painting something, and all of a sudden you realize it's not going to be seen because you're in the wrong area. Again, if I need to pick up a local color, this red, I can pick that up, put that back in there. Now I've got some reflected light onto this one. You can do the same thing for the cube. Got this one. Remember, select the area. I'm going to hit hide. Let's make this cube nice and blue. Working at 100%. Give it. So that's going to be a light blue. We'll select the top of it. Get my brush. This one's going to be a little bit darker. Get my selection tool. Hide it. And I'm using my keyboard shortcuts. W, B, Command H, all of those. Maybe this darker area is going to be a little bit more purple. I think that's too much. That's getting there. A little bit better. Then we go back, we start to add highlights to it. If I wanted, I can work just within the blue area. I can pick up my color picker, grab my brush. If I pick up my color picker, maybe I'd want it to be something like that. Hitting 1, going down to 10%. We'll bring in some of the light that we're working with as well. All I gotta do now, select my magic wand, hit hide. Maybe we'll get a little bit lighter up in this area. If I needed a lighter blue to choose from, let's pull in some green. Green could easily be done up at the top. And of course for the purple area, select that, we'll get a little bit darker purple, and that's cool too. Brush tool. And making with that. So of course we always want to have our drop shadows, we want to have highlights, good form. Look at your reference photos. You can see here where the highlights are. Feel free to change around where your light source is. They don't always have to come from the top left. It can be low angled, bottom right. They can be higher angle. Anything else that you have. Yeah, there we go. Notice on the square that's right here, I've got a nice highlight that's going right along that edge. So if I wanted to paint that in on mine, I'm going to grab my brush tool. Let's deselect that. I'm going to just pick up some white. Give myself a really, really small brush. Very tiny. I'm going to click and just pull through on that edge. I may have to do it several times. Let's bring this up to 100%. Ooh, too much, too much. Let's back it up. Even lighter edge from here. One of the hardest textures to paint or to draw is definitely going to be your metal texture. So something that's chrome or something that has a good reflection. I'm going to be honest, I'm not the best at drawing these either, but here's the principles behind drawing and painting metal. Whatever the surface texture is, or excuse me, the surface shape is, you've got to understand how the objects that are reflected are going to be warped. This is why you need to always have a good reference photo. If you look at the spheres and these textures, reference photos that I have, you can see there are no straight lines anywhere. This is because on the surface of a sphere, there's really no straight lines for light to bounce off of. So if you've got a reflection, everything about it has to be curving, and that curve goes either to the top center, bottom center, or left and right center. If we practice this out on the sphere that I have, I've painted mine a little bit darker than middle gray. And so if I gave it a line plane, by the way, I want to set my hardness of my brush to be a little bit more harder, not exactly 100%, give it a little softer edge. But if I was to give a ground plane on this sphere, it wouldn't go straight across as you see here. Instead, the edges of it would start to curve up, so it would curve around more something like this. And you can see this happening in all of the other ones, little examples that I'm giving you. Next, everything else in it needs to curve. This includes your light source. So if I was to do a highlighted area, this time I'm going to make it a little bit softer edge. My highlighted area needs to have a curvature to it. And if we'll say in this case, just like the top one, it's a square light. That square light isn't going to look so square. It's going to look something a little more like this. And in this case, it does have a little small one down there. The second thing to pay attention to, especially if it's a black and white image, is that there's no solid colors like we see here. No solid gray, solid white. Even there are shades and gradients amongst that. Another thing is you pay attention to the edges of a sphere. Those edges are actually reflecting what's immediately around you in that 180-degree type circle. So if you've got something darker or lighter, that needs to show up along the edges of your sphere as well. I'm going to continue copying this top right-hand corner one. See, I'll grab a little bit lighter. We'll set this down to hardness to 0%. And I'm going to drop my opacity down to 20. Now I'm going to paint in the edge as if there was something, a little something along the edge. Maybe not so much. If you hear any rattling behind me, that's my dog. She's just got her bath, and so she has to stay in her cage. But there we go. So now I've got a good edge. The thing about that edge is it also gives me some contrast to whatever is in the background. It doesn't have to stay 100% of what you have. We can go back and maybe pick up some a little bit of darken that edge in. That looks good too. Now let's continue working on this middle portion as well. We'll drop down the opacity, make it a really, really soft edge. This time I'm working with less than 10%, and I've got a darker texture. Let's get a little bit darker. We're going to paint in that darker bit too. This is where it pays to constantly practice your drawing and your seeing of the world around you. Let's pull that up a little bit, maybe get a darker edge. Even the drop shadow, or excuse me, the cast shadow is going to be reflected on here. So usually the bottom edge of anything that's chrome is going to be much, much darker, simply because it's picking up that cast shadow. That's looking pretty good. Let's go back around and clean up some of these highlights. Some of the highlights aren't as solid, so we're going to give it a little fuzzier edge. Again, the more reflective it is, the crisper your edges are going to be. But if you've got something maybe that's a tarnished metal or something that is a little bit rougher, it's not going to be as reflective, and you can get away with a little bit more. I can constantly play around with this. It just helps to have really, really good reference photos when you're painting and working with metallic textures. Again, if you want to, find a reference photo of something that's got a lot of color in there. It doesn't have to be black and white, but I do recommend using black and white if you're going to start off doing this type of stuff as well. All right, so from here, I'm just going to give it a stop and let y'all finish out yours. Remember, I'm looking for 3 different paintings. One of them needs to be just solid black and white grayscale. Give me another one that's going to be saved in color. And this final one, do your best to do a metallic type texture for what we're working with. All right.